Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I welcome you to a virtual evening with Kaitlyn Greenidge to discuss her new novel, Libertie, published by our friends at Algonquin Books. Inspired by the life of one of the first Black female doctors in the United States and rich with historical detail, Libertie will resonate with readers eager to understand our present through a deep, moving, and lyrical dive into our past. Kaitlyn Greenidge's debut novel, We Love You, Charlie Freeman, was one of the New York Times Critics' top 10 books of 2016 and a finalist for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize. Kaitlyn is a contributing writer for the New York Times, and her writing has also appeared in Vogue, Glamour, The Wall Street Journal, and elsewhere. She is the recipient of fellowships from the Whitting Foundation, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. To moderate tonight's conversation, we're joined by the wonderful Jaquira Díaz. Jaquira was born in Puerto Rico and raised in Miami. She's the author of Ordinary Girls, a memoir, winner of a Whitting Award, a Florida Book Awards Gold Medal, and a Lambda Literary Awards finalist. A former visiting assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's MFA program in creative writing and consulting editor at the Kenyon Review, she splits her time between Montreal, Miami Beach, and the UK with her spouse, the writer Lars Horn. Her second book, I Am Deliberate, a novel, is forthcoming from Algonquin Books. Throughout this evening's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen. And you can order your copy of Libertie from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guest to the virtual stage. Welcome, Kaitlyn.
Thank you.
Hello.
So much. Hello.
Welcome. Hi.
Hi. Good evening. Hello again. How are you? I know it.
Sorry, I feel like I have to celebrate this book because this book is so beautiful. I mean, I told you this already, but it's so beautiful. And I cannot say this enough to everyone that's watching. Get this book, get Libertie. I have to say that as I read, I had one of those moments when I was like so jealous. I was like, this is so good. I wish I'd written this sentence. I wish I'd written this phrase. And then I kept turning pages and I just kept having this feeling of, I can't believe this is your second book. I was just, I'm incomplete, like I'm fangirling right now, so I'm going to stop. But I was having that feeling. And I'll talk more about what specifically about that it was. But I wanted to start off so that everybody who's tuned in can get a sense of the book, ask you to read for a few minutes, however long you need, whatever passage you'd like to read.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much for those really kind words about the book. I write it for you are exactly sort of the type of reader who I would hope have a great reaction to it, so thank you. I'm a huge fan of your work as well. So it really means a lot to hear that. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to read from, it's a little bit into the first maybe or second quarter of the book, I guess. So Libertie is a novel based in part on the life of Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, who was the first Black female doctor in New York State. It's loosely based on her life, and it's told from the point of view of the doctor's daughter, Libertie. And so the section I'm going to read from, it's a novel that takes place during Reconstruction for the most part, but the section I'm going to read from takes place during the Civil War, when Libertie and her mother, the doctor, are sort of organizing with the women in their community around how they're going to respond to the disruption of the war in the lives of the people around them. We did not know it then, but this is how we would spend the rest of the war. All of us in that room there became a sisterhood. We called ourselves the Ladies' Intelligence Society. It had started as a kind of joke when the few men in town asked the women where they were going, why they spent so much time at Dr. Sampson's house. I was a mascot of sorts, the doctor's girl who was always in the room. We were hell-bent on plotting. How could we get information from Kings County to Ohio, to Maryland, to Virginia, to the West, about the children left in the destroyed orphanage? How could we find their parents? It was from hours of those meetings that we found the father of the baby I'd carried off the boat, got word to him, were able to send her to relatives in Massachusetts. She was no longer in my arms, but I could still feel the weight of her there pressing. Whenever I did, I'd fold my arms over my chest and pray again to the woman in the water, keep her safe, keep them safe, keep us safe. After the war became everyone's refrain, we read of men dying every day, even as a few of those made their way off the battlefield, their eyes wide with horror. Whenever the war ended, if it ended, whoever won, we knew there would be colored people in need of aid. And what could we do from the safety and comfort of our town that the whites had overlooked? What would help them best? A school, Miss Annie said. The women all nodded. That was a given. Homes, Miss Dinah added. But it was Mama who cleared her throat and said, a hospital. She looked around the room. For colored people, she said, we cannot live in freedom if we are not well. There was a moment of silence as the women turned the idea around, and Mama very carefully would not look at Miss Hannah, who was crying now, but Miss Annie, Miss Clara, and Miss Dinah nodded, and it was decided that this was where their efforts would go toward, a hospital for whoever made it out alive to become whole again. It was hard planning, oftentimes hours of talking with no clear answers, but when the women got going, the whole room began to vibrate. Sometimes it seemed that the white walls themselves flushed when the women raised their voices. How strange it was to sit around them, at their feet or in the corner, and hear them shout, these same women who all week long told me and the other colored girls in town to speak softly, to keep our heads down and our backs straight, to train our eyes to overlook the insults the world outside of town heaped at our feet. Those women told girls like me to ignore the present-day horrors around us, to look only toward the future, toward another place that did not exist yet. But here in the room, I could imagine that I was already there. The women would begin the meeting sitting upright, but by the end, they would be sprawled, leaning against seats, arms crossed over stools, sipping water, laughing, shouting back and forth. You knew a meeting was getting work done when Miss Dinah began her sharp, piercing giggle. It was uncontrollable, a little hysterical, and did not necessarily prompt the other women to join in. It was more like the whistle of a tea kettle. It told you pressure was high, waters were roiling to a boil, that something was happening. And then whatever it was a wondrous and yet as deceptively common as water transforming into air. I have never in my life felt anything as powerful as whatever force was in that room while those women talked, and I began to believe that it was the talking itself that did it, that perhaps women's voices and harmony were like some sort of flintstone sparking, or like the hot burst of air that comes through a window, billowing the curtains before rain. Sometimes I imagine the whole room lifting up through their talk, lifting up and spinning out into the future times to come, when everyone would be truly free, the time I thought we were all planning for. To bring them back down when a workday was done, they would turn to some sort of amusement. It had to be something calming, something sober. We need to rest a little in order to keep going, was what Miss Annie always said. And they decided on trading compliments. They'd write them down on slips of paper, unsigned but addressed to the lady they wished to compliment, and then put them in an old flower tin Mama had. And at the end of the meeting, they'd draw the slips out one at a time and read the ode. And then the fun began in guessing the author. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for reading. When you started, you talked a little bit about how it was inspired by the first Black woman, or one of the first Black women doctors in the United States. And I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit more about how you came across that story and like what inspired the idea for the characters in the book.
Absolutely. So I worked for many years at the Weeksville Heritage Center, which is located in central Brooklyn, in Brooklyn, New York, in Crown Heights, essentially. And it's dedicated to the history of Weeksville, which is this free Black community that was founded in Brooklyn in 1838. And Weeksville was founded essentially as a Black power base in New York State after slavery was ended in New York State. A group of Black men got together. They bought this swath of land that at that point would have been pretty remote from everything, and pretty unvaluable, not have much value. So they brought this sort of lot of land. They divided it into smaller lots, and then they specifically targeted other Black men, other Black families to buy those lots of land and create sort of this town. Because at that point in New York, to vote, you had to have a certain amount of land. You had to be a landowner with a certain amount of land. So the whole point of the town was like this really desire for Black freedom, Black political destiny, Black political self-determination. And one of the founders who was sort of orchestrating all of this, his name was Sylvana Smith, and his daughter, Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart, she became the first Black female doctor in New York State. When I worked at Weeksville, I did a bunch of different jobs for them. They're a wonderful museum. If you're ever in Brooklyn, you should try and visit them. One of the things that I did with them was I worked on their oral history project, and we were looking for descendants of the original Weeksville residents, the 19th century residents. And so we met with this woman. Her name is Ellen Hawley. She was a soap opera actress in the 70s. Some people recognize her name from One Life to Live. She was famous for being in the first interracial kiss on daytime television. She's also a really beautiful historian. She wrote a history of her family's genealogy called One Life, where she can trace them back to the 1700s in New York State. And so she came and we did this oral history with her about Sylvana Smith and the doctor. But she told us a story that we didn't know yet, which was about the doctor's daughter, this woman who married the son of the Episcopal Archbishop of Haiti. She married into this Black expatriate family in Haiti. The marriage fell apart very quickly, and she would write all these letters home to her mother saying, please help me figure out how to get out of this marriage. And eventually the doctor did figure out how to smuggle her out of Haiti because her in-laws weren't letting her leave. And for the rest of her life, she lived in New Jersey. She settled down. Ellen Hawley was her granddaughter. And she would tell Ellen Hawley all about how much she loved Haiti, how much she loved that country, even as she sort of had this really unhappy and abusive marriage there. And they had all these letters, the letters back and forth between the mother and the daughter. And they also had the letters that the in-laws sent after she left, which would say things like, when you left, not only did you leave this family, but you have given up on the idea of the Black family. You're bringing shame to the entire Black race. The whole reason why this family was in Haiti was to sort of set up this Black utopia apart from the US, and to have a broken marriage in it. They thought that was bringing great shame to their whole political project. So not only was she leaving this abusive marriage, but she was the weight of Black people in the Americas was sort of put on her shoulders of whether or not she was going to stay. And when Ellen Hawley told us that story, she's an actress and she's old Hollywood. So she had like this old Black Hollywood accent. It's kind of like Lena Horne, like very beautiful voice. And she's telling us all this. And what was really fascinating was that she was able to talk about how damaging that must have been to have been the daughter of the first Black female doctor in New York State, to have married into this illustrious family, to be in this extremely privileged position. But to know that personally, your personal life was not dependent on you sort of breaking from all of that, and the courage that it must have took to break from all of that, when the wider world is telling you all of your choices are wrong, sort of no matter what you do. And so when I heard that story, I was just so fascinated, and I thought, if I ever get a chance to write a novel, I would love to write it about that. And so that's where the impetus came from for Libertie.
Thank you. So that, I feel like that alone, like that pressure runs throughout most of the book. And it's kind of what Libertie is kind of struggling against, like this idea that people are expecting so much of her, like she has to do this because people expect her to, especially her mother. Mm-hmm. And the title, I think, works so well because Libertie is kind of one of the themes is exploring questions of freedom, like what does freedom mean? And I feel like in a lot of ways, every character in the book struggles with that a little bit. And can you talk a little bit about what you felt you were trying to interrogate with each character, or what freedom means to each character?
Yeah, one of the questions that I wanted to sort of explore was just that question. Freedom is one of those words that I think everybody seems to have their own personal definition for, and our definitions are often conflicting. So I wanted to think of a definition of freedom that didn't have domination at its core, because I think, especially in U.S. culture, U.S. political culture especially, we tend to define freedom about what a person or a country or a city can get away with doing to whoever has less power than them, whether that's another group of people or another gender or another race or, like the land itself. Like all those things are how we traditionally mark freedom in this culture. So I wanted to look at freedom, what happens when you sort of don't have that core part of domination in it. And then also the fact that freedom is so dependent on your social relations and social position. So what looks like freedom in a person who's at the top of a social hierarchy it's a very different look than freedom for the person who's at the bottom. And oftentimes when the person at the bottom is attempting to even express sort of the smallest of freedoms, they're heavily policed and heavily sort of told like, no, that's not okay, or that's going to get out of control, or it's going to spring out of control, or we got to like hold that in. So Libertie was a really fun character to write because in some ways she's extremely privileged. She's freeborn in the US during right before the Civil War. Her mother's a doctor. They live in relative comfort and ease, and she's educated. On other ways, she is always going to be the lowest person in whatever situation she walks into, because we meet her when she's 7 years old. She's a young girl in a patriarchal society, so she's always going to be at the bottom. She's dark-skinned and she's a woman, and so she sort of inhabits at certain times and in certain places that she encounters, her position in wherever she is shifts slightly. And what she's going to understand as freedom shifts for the people around her as well. And there are these sort of competing definitions.
Thank you. So I felt like one of the things that I kept thinking about as I was reading Libertie's character as she was getting older was definitely this idea that she definitely understood what freedom meant to her, like what she wanted, and that other people didn't really have a sense of what life was like for her, because almost everyone around her, it's her mother and a lot of other people are thinking about this hierarchy and this idea of skin tone, skin color. And I thought, can you talk a little bit about colorism in the book and the kinds of research that you did into colorism or personal relationships with people with darker skin, especially when it has to do with family? I asked this specifically because one of the things that I researched when I was writing Ordinary Girls was this idea of colorism. I'm biracial, I have a white mother and a Black father, and it was something that was always ever present in our Puerto Rican family, this idea of Blackness and of who is considered Black, and whether I was even seen as Black. I was only ever seen as Black, read by Black by other people when I was in my family, like with my Black family. And then to me, the idea of passing seemed violent. It was like a complete erasure of my identity. And so as I'm reading this, I'm like thinking about all this research that goes into writing a book that's very much about race and freedom, but that's historical and that's not taking place today. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think what's so fascinating is, there's colorism is sort of like a theme throughout, I think, literature of the Americas. And, like different literary traditions sort of treat it differently, or maybe like not so differently, but how people actually interpret it is changes a little bit, I think. And so I tried to read as much as I could about sort of the sociology behind colorism. That was really helpful. And what the thing that just really struck me was I read a few studies where they talked about how who's considered light-skinned and who's considered dark-skinned. It's arbitrary. It really depends on who is actually in the community. So someone who in one community is considered dark-skinned could be considered light-skinned in another, and vice versa. It really depends on the people around you. And that's true for both Black and non-Black people looking at skin color. So that's just, it's literally it's so subjective, and yet the actual effects of it, material effects on it on a person's life, sociologists have studied are very real. It affects marriage rates, it affects sentencing, it affects job conditions, how much you make, even health outcomes, all these things are affected by it. But the actual judging over like who is light skinned and who is dark skinned is completely, there's no rhyme or reason to it at all, really. Once you get into like really gradations of shades, there's no real sort of information about. So I found that the subjectiveness is so interesting. And I wanted to sort of relay, particularly Libertie is dark skinned. Her mother is light enough to pass, as was her grandfather. So I wanted to get, I think oftentimes currently when people talk about colorism today, just like in our general cultural air, I think people oftentimes skip over the fact that most of us have varying skin shades in our own families. And so when we're talking about it, we're talking about our family members. Oftentimes we're talking about people who are in our families. And what I find so frustrating, I think, especially, Twitter is a wasteland, but especially in a space like Twitter, is people act like that's not a thing. Like you can't, like most of us can't pull down our family photo album and sort of like see that there's very many different shades, and everybody is sort of experiencing this slightly differently. And even the story of how you understand your family is probably going to be different member to member because of this. But that part seems to be not a part of the conversation, because I think it complicates things a lot. And I think oftentimes the conversation sort of focuses on like, I was a dark-skinned person and I didn't feel comfortable in the space, or I was a light-skinned person, I didn't feel comfortable in the space, unless the really more heart-rending thing, which is like, I have a relative where we are family, we love each other, we live in the same town. In many ways, we have the exact same experience, and yet in these different ways, our life is different, and we don't necessarily have the language to talk about that or to acknowledge that. And so that's what I wanted for Libertie and her mother. Her mother loves her fiercely. Her mother thinks that she's beautiful. Her mother thinks she's a prize. Her mother thinks she's the best thing she's ever done. And yet they're experiencing Kings County, New York, they're experiencing this predominantly white space very, very differently because of their skin color, and because her mother doesn't necessarily have the wherewithal to understand how different it feels for Libertie. They have the beginning of this break between them in this relationship.
Yeah, so I think that was one of the pieces to me that felt most intimate was their letters, the exchange. When Libertie gets a letter from her mother, and her mother says that she's been to the movie theater, and she is like, she passed in order to get to the movie theater. And that kind of feels like a betrayal to her, that she's like, I'm experiencing the world in this way, and she has no idea, and she passed to go to the movies or to go to the theater. Can you talk a little bit about the research, or what writing historical fiction is actually like what the research for the book was like, what the research process was like when you get into Haiti, and writing about Haiti?
Yeah. The research part was, especially around Haiti, was very daunting because I'm not Haitian. I'm not Haitian American. I don't speak Creole and I don't speak French. I'm interested in the history of Haiti, but that's where my entryway comes through. And so I was really aware of how often American authors, American fiction writers fail Haiti when they try to write about it. And so I really wanted to sort of steer clear of those pitfalls or those stereotypes. And so I tried to read as much as I could, of course, about the different time periods. For me, the entryway to get around sort of the self-consciousness I felt around the research in Haiti was to recognize that the Haiti sections are still through the eyes of Libertie, and Libertie herself is an outsider when she gets there. So there's going to be things that she gets wrong or doesn't necessarily notice, or that she only half understands. And so once I sort of understood that about her as a character, it freed me up to be able to read as much as I could, but not feel like I had to spend, like 3 years making sure that I read every single possible thing about this particular thing that I wanted to include in the novel, because then I would just be, I'd still be writing it. I wouldn't get very far. So
thank you. It definitely feels like when I'm reading the parts set in Haiti, that it's written with a lot of generosity.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some of the writing in the first half, it feels almost transformational. Like her character is not just transformed, but the writing itself suddenly is kind of growing on and expanding. And one of the moments that I want to talk about before we get into questions from the audience was writing intimacy. There are moments when I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to give any spoilers, but there are moments when Libertie, that there are moments of intimacy and love and sex. And the writing was so lush and full of poetry and music. And it felt very much like a celebration of Black love and Black beauty and desire. And I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about how you got the idea for that. Because I just thought, reading that section, I thought, this is next level. This is beautiful, but also it is doing so much. The book broke my heart. I just want to say. But can you talk a little bit about how you got the idea to write that?
Yeah. So I wanted her to have this relationship with, she meets this man, Emmanuel, who is a Black man born in America, but who has been raised in Haiti. He's come back to sort of study with her mom. He himself is also very light-skinned, but he's brought full into the idea of a Black utopia in Haiti, and he's sort of charmed her and seduced her with this idea. And I wanted to build their relationship in a way that the love between them made sense. I think in the first draft of this, when I brought it to my editor, Kathy Porres at Algonquin, she was like, I don't know if these two characters actually like each other. I don't know that I believe that they're going to fall in love or get married. And so I was like, oh, that's a wake up call to sort of write this. I think when I was writing it, I got sort of the first draft, I got sort of, I think I got caught up in sort of like, these characters are living in the 1860s. Like, how much are they actually going to sort of say on the page? But I did want a reader to feel like they were really in love, like there was a real bond between the two of them. And so I started to try and think about how each of them would talk about their desire in a way that made sense for their time period and for themselves, but also felt lush to a reader. And so my in was to go back and to read Song of Solomon, the Song of Songs in the Bible. And I had a really good friend, my friend Carrie Carnahan. She's at UConn. She's a poet and now she's a biblical scholar. And she's working on a new translation of Song of Solomon. And so she sort of said, you should check out these interpretations of this Bible, part of the Bible from these Black feminists, these Black womanist preachers who really see this book, part of the Bible, as a celebration of, in particular, female sexuality, the female orgasm. And it's also a book that recognizes that colorism exists. The main speaker starts by saying, like, I'm calmly in dark, or whatever it is that her line is that I forget now. But, that she is dark and her lover is fair is mentioned throughout that part of the Bible. And so it seemed like that, like I was like, okay, this is it. This is sort of like the perfect way to think about it. And I read it so many times and sort of thought about how much that part of the Bible uses so much of the natural world as just really beautiful metaphors for sex and for desire. And so I tried to have that be part of the character's consciousness.
Thank you. It worked because it broke me. I'm still going back reading it again, like, oh no. Yes. Thank you so much for that explanation. I have to go back and read the Bible now. I'm gonna get to some questions from the audience. If you have a question, please feel free to put it in the Ask a Question box, and I'll be happy to ask your question. Some readers just want to let you know, Dominique says, my copy of the book arrived today. I'm so excited to read it. Yes, you will love it.
Yes, please.
Diane Jones says, is the college in Ohio inspired at all by Oberlin College in Ohio? The Conservatory of Music there made me make an association.
Partly it is. I started to think about Oberlin a little bit, but then I got really sort of interested in this early history of the of HBCUs. So I think in the first drafts of the book, I was thinking that this would be possibly an integrated college like Oberlin was at a certain point. And then as the book went on, and I realized I really didn't want any white characters to be the focal point for Libertie, that she's going to live within sort of this all Black world of the 19th century, more or less. And then as I was reading the histories of the HBCUs and sort of there's these beautiful photographs of the Hampton Institute in the 1870s and 80s in the Library of Congress. They're absolutely gorgeous. They're just so fascinating, and it has all the students at the Hampton Institute at this HBCU. They're literally building the campus from hand, and then there's students sort of like sitting in these beautiful sort of pinafore dresses, and they're doing like anatomy lessons. And I was just so enamored of that stuff. So originally it was a little bit based on Oberlin, but then as I sort of got more into the research around the Black colleges, I just sort of scuttled that part of it.
Thank you. My friend just texted me, wants to know if there will be a Libertie movie.
Oh, I don't know. You know, hopefully we can figure something out. I would love it to be a movie or like a limited TV series. You know, I was really excited that so many people were excited about Bridgerton when that came out, because obviously it's not totally like Libertie, but you know, it made me excited that a TV or movie producer could understand that you could make a historical or period drama with people of color that didn't have to be a slave narrative necessarily, and that people would get excited for it, and that people would want to see these characters of color, you know, get off in the past. Like we could see what's happen, and people are really drawn to, you know, that part of Bridgerton. So I'm excited that we are in a sort of like a creative landscape right now where those things seem possible on the screen in ways that they didn't even a couple of years ago.
So am I. I'm just putting it out there. You know, whoever's watching, I would love to watch a Libertie film or TV show or both, spin-off series, whatever it is. I want to see it. So let's get it done, Hollywood. Yeah. And then I have another question. I think we have time for one more, but I'd really love to talk about the woman in the water, and how you got the idea for the woman in the water and what she represents throughout the book. Because I feel like in the very beginning, I thought of her as a very real woman. And then I realized what you were doing, and I thought, oh no, she is not real. There is this mythology running through the book. And then it started to make even more sense. So can you talk a little bit about the woman in the water?
Sure. I wanted to have... you know, I wanted there to be a through line between the parts in Brooklyn and the parts in Haiti. And so I knew from the start that I wanted to sort of explore the tradition of Voudon when I wrote the parts in Haiti, but I didn't want those parts to come off as like sensationalistic or like Libertie as sort of like a bystander. So I wanted to have references to that throughout, but I was trying to figure out how can there be references if Libertie hasn't gone there yet, or nobody's sort of gone there yet. So I was trying to find ways to have references to these traditions, and the woman in the water is, you know, she's various Loas at certain points. Sometimes she's La Saran, sometimes she's Erzule, sometimes she's all these sorts of people she has references to. But I also wanted her presence to be something that has a real world explanation. I didn't necessarily want the novel to totally veer into magical realism. So the woman in the water could be all those things, but then she's also very much the invention of a character is severely traumatized and is just trying to make sense of slavery that he's just lived through and his escape from slavery that he's just lived through. And, you know, it is a coping mechanism for him to sort of continually see this beautiful, seductive woman around him that he believes is coming from him. And similarly for Libertie, you know, as she gets disillusioned with her mother, it is totally psychologically understandable why she would become so invested in this other sort of mythical figure who can do all the things that, you know, her mother actually can't because her mother's human. So I wanted both of those things to be in tension with that character. And then just also to be able to explore those traditions of that figure in various cultures, that figure of a woman in the water, the association between women and water, that is sort of throughout diasporic religions and practices, you know, throughout the Americas. I wanted to sort of explore that too as well. So
thank you so much. Libertie by Kaitlyn Greenidge. If you don't have your copy yet, you can order it from Books and Books. And thank you so much for joining us, Kaitlyn.
Thank you for the wonderful questions. Thank you for this interview, and thank you to Books and Books too. I just really appreciate that you guys are hosting this. And
oh my God, it's our absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for being here with us. I wonder if you could talk a little bit. I was just curious about your experience as a Black writer, and maybe about diversity in publishing. And do you feel that things are changing truly? Because I feel that they're changing a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a sense of not hopelessness, hopefulness. That was, hopefulness about it. But I wonder if you could share a little bit about that.
You know, I think it's difficult to say. I just spent this morning reading a really long oral history with a woman who's was one of the first Black literary agents in New York, who started working in publishing in like 1968 or whatever. And she went into this sort of long explanation of the waves. I think that, you know, if you are a reader for a long time, you sort of notice that like there are these waves of a huge influx of Black literature in the 60s and 70s, and then sort of like a loss of a lot of writers in the 80s, and then a big wave in the 90s, and then a loss of a lot of writers at the turn of the millennium, and then another big wave, you know, coming back. And so I think the thing is, like, hopefully this wave is sustainable. And I think the difference between now and those other past times when it was much easier to sort of just pretend that there were these sort of like trends or cycles of writing, the biggest change is the internet, right? The biggest change right now is social media. The biggest change is the fact that, you know, what would happen in, say, like the 60s or 70s when you know, sort of en masse media would decide, okay, we're done talking about radicalism, we're done talking about civil rights, we're done talking about Black liberation, we're done talking about sort of all these political things. It's the 80s now, we're in a new era, we don't want to talk about that anymore, and just would sort of choke off those conversations that were happening in literary spaces, or decenter them and sort of center on something else. That kind of sway can't really happen anymore. You know, people are having conversations whether or not they're fashionable. People are having conversations whether or not, you know, editors in New York say that they're tired of reading those types of books. You can always sort of find those communities, and finding those communities for a writer is also much easier too. You know, I am so grateful that I'm publishing and writing at the time period that I am, because you know, I think what used to happen is that you could write, even for nonfiction, you could write a really beautiful piece about Blackness or race or something like that, and it would be published, and perhaps people would be really excited about it, but it would die within 3 or 4 weeks. You know, there would be no way for people to sort of reread it. Whereas something like, you know, I wrote a piece about the history of colorism for The Guardian at this point, like 3 years ago in 2018. That piece lives on. I mean, that piece is having a whole other life on Instagram that I don't know about, that people will tag me into conversations with occasionally. But you know, like, that piece lives on, and every couple months someone will say, you know, I'm doing a podcast episode about this piece and I want to talk about it or whatever. And it's because it lives on the internet in a way that those things couldn't necessarily even 10 or 15 years ago. So I think those things make me really hopeful that, you know, despite our best efforts, you know, I think if Trump had won, we would be looking at a very different literary landscape, and people would be talking about how there's a backlash and the country doesn't want these types of books anymore. Mm-hmm. But because that's not the political reality that we're in right now, we have a little bit longer of a lifeline going. Mm-hmm. That makes me hopeful.
Yeah, because, you know, I read The Prophets. I don't know if you've read that. Yeah. And I was blown away by that last year. Mm-hmm. You know? And you know, again, back to the whole like Black love and desire, and intimacy. And, you know, and I feel that a lot of times these conversations that have been possible in this like virtual landscape have been so incredibly like special, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what's really exciting is I think we are all collectively getting more sophisticated about these conversations, which is really exciting. You know, and I think that's something to look forward to too, that, you know, as we continue to publish and write books, we get the chance to go deeper because these conversations are being sustained in these places because they're able to live and breathe for a little bit longer, you know?
Amen.
Yeah.
So again, thank you. Thank you to viewers watching from everywhere. Thanks for joining us. You know, our locally owned independent bookseller. Thanks for your support. Thank you, Kaitlyn, for your work. Jaquira, for yours, for your moderating, for being with us today. Your questions were really insightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really, really wonderful. So
get Libertie.
get Libertie. Get some Libertie.
Yes.
Okay. Well, then I will say goodnight then, unless you want to do a final reading or do anything like that.
No, I think that's okay. I'll say goodnight. And, you know, thank you very much for having me. And I love these questions, Jaquira. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your brilliance and your art.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I hope the next time we'll be in person sometime soon.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Take care.